The first area within fairness, transparency, and accountability, of course, is algorithmic fairness. And our work within PAI in this space really concentrates at the intersection of algorithmic fairness, demographic data, and the law. So the problem we're really trying to address here is, despite growing calls for organizations to address algorithmic bias, in practice, they often face barriers when it comes to trying to measure and mitigate bias in practice. And some of the work that we've done at PAI suggests that there are specifically legal, reputational, and technical barriers when it comes to using demographic data in service of fairness goals. And in practice, this often prevents wider spread action around algorithmic bias issues. So our work in this area comes in two stages. First off, we're working to map the current barriers facing organizations. And this comes within two lines of work. One that focuses on the legal compatibility of bias mitigation techniques, and another that focuses on demographic data and its use in bias detection. And then the second stage is, once we have mapped out these current barriers, we'll be working towards a multi-stakeholder process to try to generate recommendations for how to address these issues. So first off, the area of work around legal compatibility of bias mitigation involves questions of how do we ensure that bias mitigation strategies are compatible with the law? And so why is this important? Why do we care about legal compatibility? It's important if we actually want to prevent the proliferation of biased algorithms in practice. If we want to, for example, demonstrate evidence of algorithmic bias and ensure that this evidence has teeth to it, then it must be accepted by what judges, juries, or regulators would consider to be evidence of discrimination. Similarly, if we actually want to mitigate bias, then the techniques that we use cannot be considered discriminatory in and of themselves. And so our work in this space first started with a project looking at the legal compatibility of fairness definitions, whereby we took several terms that are commonly used in the machine learning fairness literature that are actually legal terms. And we mapped these out and found that there are significant divergences between how the machine learning and legal communities are approaching fairness. And this is work that we presented at the HCML workshop at NeurIPS last year. In addition, we've looked at the tensions specifically around using protected class variables. So these are variables like race, disability, religion that are protected under US anti-discrimination law. And the reason that there's a tension here is, on the one hand, we have a technical need to use these sorts of variables if we want to detect and mitigate bias. The intuition being that if we actually want to actively address disparities across different groups as evidenced through various data or algorithms, then we actually need to take into account what groups people are in and then try to actively reverse these biased trends. And also, removing these variables from data does very little to actually prevent bias due to what's called omitted variable bias. So then why is there a tension around this? There's a tension because the law, on the other hand, has a very strong preference for decision-making that is blind to protected attributes. And in fact, some proposed regulations look to the presence or absence of these variables as evidence of algorithmic bias. So for example, late last year, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development proposed a rule around disparate impact liability, which is a form of anti-discrimination liability, whereby there would be a safe harbor for algorithms that do not make use of protected class variables or close proxies. So why do we need to resolve this tension? Why does it matter that there's this disconnect between, on the one hand, a technical necessity to use these variables, and on the other hand, the law's desire for blindness around these variables? This is important because the law might inadvertently prohibit the use of bias mitigation techniques. And even if the law does not prohibit these techniques, legal uncertainty in this space might drive organizations towards inaction around algorithmic bias as what might be perceived to be the safest solution. So then what can well-meaning algorithm developers do to address algorithmic bias in their models in a legal way? So that's the topic of two of our papers in this space. One is Reconciling Legal and Technical Approaches to Algorithmic Bias, which is forthcoming in the Tennessee Law Review and WeRobot conference. And this discusses the importance of distinguishing between different use cases of protected class variables. So are you using these variables to increase the salience of this protected attribute or decrease it? Are you trying to debias your model or bias your model? And this paper also specifically proposes causality and causal inference as a unifying concept in both the machine learning and legal contexts that can help draw these distinctions between different use cases of protected attributes. In addition, we have a paper forthcoming called Affirmative Algorithms, the Legal Grounds for Fairness as Awareness, and this examines the extent to which algorithmic fairness techniques might be interpreted from a legal perspective as being forms of affirmative action, and how jurisprudence from the higher education context might create some roadblocks towards actually mitigating bias in practice. And this paper proposes a path forward looking through the strong basis in evidence standard that is used in government contracting cases. So those were some of the projects that we've worked on in the legal compatibility realm. The other aspect of algorithmic fairness we focused on is this idea of demographic data and bias detection. So our work here started with a convening we hosted earlier this year, co-located with the FATSTAR convention. And this was a closed-door convening where we brought together academic and industry experts from both the legal and machine learning communities to talk about how demographic data should be used ideally in terms of fairness goals, or should not be used, I should say. And the discussion surfaced a lot of really key themes, in particular around legal uncertainty, reputational risks, privacy concerns, and definitional issues in terms of what counts versus doesn't count as demographic data. And so we have some takeaways that we've published as a white paper that you can find at the link below. But we've also built upon the insights from that convening with an interview project. So the goal of this project was to more specifically map out these legal, reputational, and technical challenges that folks are experiencing in practice. And our goal at the end of the day is to enable organizations to take more action to address algorithmic bias by mapping out what are the challenges that they are experiencing, and then using that as a basis for our multi-stakeholder work in terms of generating best practices and recommendations. So next up, McCain Andrus, who is a research associate at PAI, will be talking more about this demographic data interview project that we've conducted and some of the preliminary findings from that work.
Hi, I'm McCain Andrus, and I'm a research associate on the FTA team. As with our work around algorithmic fairness in the law, our project around fairness and demographic data stemmed from this core question of when is algorithmic fairness even feasible? And so, as Alice discussed, most proposed algorithmic fairness solutions require access to demographic attributes of interest at some point. So, for instance, if you were to test racial bias in credit scoring, you're probably going to need access to racial data to make any sort of comparisons. And so, to illustrate how core of a requirement demographic data is to algorithmic fairness, searching for fairness tools surfaces the following toolkits that require demographic data to assess and mitigate bias. Now, on the other hand, here are the fairness tools that we found that don't require access to demographic data. And that's because it uses simulations and not real-world data. Now, is this a problem? Well, when demographic data is sensitive, regulated, or otherwise protected, yes. So building off of prior work, we know that there may be legal forces constraining the collection or use of demographic data. For anti-discrimination, this might look like restrictions on using demographic attributes, even when the intent is to improve the fairness of the system. For data privacy, there's the sometimes difficult question of what attributes you're even allowed to collect or infer, and when explicit consent might be required. But what we did not know was what things actually looked like on the ground. So like what challenges around demographic data actually arise in practice. To see how things proceed in practice, we scoped an interview-based research project around these core questions. So what happens when a machine learning practitioner wants to use demographic data to assess bias or unfairness in a model or product? And what factors cause the most difficulties for practitioners trying to use demographic data in this way? And are those issues surmountable or resolvable? For some high-level details about our study, we interviewed 38 participants from 26 organizations, and we recruited these participants through a variety of methods. As part of this recruitment process, we tried to prioritize reaching individuals in a diversity of roles and sectors in order to paint a broad picture of the concerns that practitioners might encounter. For the interviews themselves, they were 60 to 75-minute conversations conducted over video conference with audio recordings. Now, for some of the high-level findings of this work, we noted that they kind of revolved around identifying data constraints that practitioners must work within, and then some of the others revolved around the actual concerns that practitioners had surrounding the use of demographic data. So looking first at the constraints on demographic data use, we found that one salient takeaway was that without explicit regulatory requirements to ensure fairness for a specific category, there's usually a deferral to privacy law and standards on what not to collect or infer. And so two elements here were especially critical. The first is the increasing role of informed consent in demographic data collection, likely as a result of data protection regulation, such as GDPR. And the second is the parallel cultural shift of only collecting data that is deemed completely necessary. Both of these constraints raise the bar for collecting data for algorithmic bias assessments, and in many cases to the point where the analysis is not conducted at all. And we found that this was especially prevalent for issues regarding race. Looking now to anti-discrimination, we probed domains where explicit anti-discrimination regulations would lead to varying degrees of demographic data collection and use. And while we saw a number of idiosyncratic practices within these industries, such as in employment and hiring, healthcare, finance, and education, few cross-cutting patterns really emerged there. For other domains where there was less clear regulation, we did note that there was a fear that what the organization was aware of, that it would be responsible for. And so, in other words, if some type of mistreatment is uncovered and the organization doesn't have a path forward, they were worried that they might now be at risk in future lawsuits of having their awareness and inaction actually be discovered. And as such, this could actually kind of deter or further deter the collection of data that would lead to more awareness. And so, in order to collect and use demographic data for the purposes of algorithmic fairness, we also found that a key component is how committed the organization is to fairness overall. And so while ensuring fairness can lead to better market coverage and other financial benefits, the reality is that the extra burden can cause conflict with established KPIs. And furthermore, if the team working on fairness cannot actually ensure that their recommendations will be followed elsewhere in the organization, it kind of calls into question for them the question of collecting more data. And so, and then finally, we heard that many technology companies are kind of already in hot water over their data collection and use practices. So visibly collecting more sensitive data runs a high risk of negative response from the public and the press. And so turning now to the concerns held by algorithmic fairness practitioners themselves, we noted that one salient issue was the actual fair and accurate collection of demographic data. And so, kind of as might be expected, there are a number of practical and ethical concerns around collecting demographic attributes. And grouping them kind of into three categories here. For self-reported demographics, there were a number of concerns around low reporting rates, low accuracy, and even an overall low trust in how the data will be used, kind of worsening the previous two issues. For inferred demographics, the concerns are somewhat shifted as the biggest question mark becomes this issue of consent. And also this approach is certainly not immune to issues of inaccuracy. For the final and kind of the rarest case of these perceived demographics, we did notice that here practitioners held concerns around consent and privacy, as well as, there are these cases where hired labelers might be in an image, and this can be highly dependent upon who's who this group doing the labeling
might be, told to identify something like the skin tone of someone in,
and
in an image.
Most types of fairness analysis do require practitioners to identify and focus on discrete groups. But one thing we heard from practitioners is that there is often some discomfort and uncertainty around what groups actually warrant attention and how those groups should even be defined. And so some salient questions on this issue are, what demographic characteristics should even be focused on? For these characteristics, what categories should be used? How do you resist the oppressive histories of these categories and characteristics? And then finally, there's also a question of who should actually be involved in the process of determining what demographics are most important to consider. And now, for this set of issues, we noted that a number of participants discussed different elements of consensual and aligned data use. And so the first of these is actually trying to enact trustworthy data collection, which participants kind of understood as ensuring that the data subjects are well informed of the intended use cases at the time of collection, and that this data is actually only going to be used towards those ends. Another category was the actual transparency in how the data gets used. And so kind of unlikely or possibly untenable in corporate settings, some participants kind of discussed this desire to actually report back to data subjects, kind of how their data was used and what decisions were informed. And finally, and perhaps kind of the most extreme of these propositions, would be the potential for data subjects to actually have a say in how their data is mobilized within the organization. And so finally, we have this kind of central issue of mitigation uncertainty. And so these are the kind of concerns surrounding what will actually be done with the data once it has been procured. And so a number of these concerns that we heard from practitioners kind of could be described as these questions of what constitutes fairness? What examples can we follow in the footsteps of? What types of solutions can my organization commit to? And is there a meaningful or technical or algorithmic solution to this issue in the first place? And so when practitioners are unsure about the answers to these questions, we saw that they were less likely to push for the collection of this data at all. And so we intend to use this work kind of as a boilerplate or as a building block for future multi-stakeholder engagements, kind of building on PAI's ability to convene various groups. We would like to kind of conduct this work to identify strategies that adhere to the regulatory standards, organizational needs, and practitioner concerns that we identified in this work. And so if that seems like something that would be of interest to you, please do reach out. We would love to hear from you, and we are excited to start that phase of the work. Thanks so much.